Well, welcome everyone to this evening's lecture with Rabbi Geoffrey Mitelman. We are thrilled that so many of you could join us here tonight. I'm Matthew Silverman, the Executive Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and I'm honored to introduce this program. For those of you who are new to a Haberman Institute event, the mission of our organization is to provide high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture, as this evening's talk will surely do. We cannot begin this evening without thanking our program sponsors, Kol Shalom and Congregation Beth El of Montgomery County, for helping us bring this program to the community. We welcome Beth El and Kol Shalom members who are joining us tonight. I also want to share a special debt of gratitude to our board member, Rabbi George Streisand, for his leadership in our Science and Judaism programming. Our next Haberman lecture is on Monday the 12th, as we welcome Pulitzer Prize winning author David Kurtzer to speak on the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara and the continuing controversy. Visit our website, habermaninstitute.org, to learn more about this program and our other lectures and courses coming up this fall. On to this evening's program. Rabbi Geoffrey Mitelman is the founding director of Sinai and Synapses, an organization that bridges the scientific and religious worlds, and is being incubated at CLAL, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. His writings about the intersection of religion and science have been published in several books and publications, including the Huffington Post, Science and Religion Today, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and My Jewish Learning. Rabbi Mitelman has been an adjunct professor at both the Hebrew Union College and the Academy for Jewish Religion, and is an internationally sought-after teacher, presenter, and scholar in residence. He was ordained by the Hebrew Union College, where he received the Cora Kahn Prize for the most outstanding sermon delivery and oratory. An alumnus of Princeton University, he received multiple prizes for outstanding scholarship in biblical and Judaic studies. I would be remiss not to share that Rabbi Mitelman also appeared on Jeopardy! In March of 2016, another impressive and important line in his resume. He lives in Westchester County with his wife, Heather, their daughter and son. Over the next 45 minutes or so, Rabbi Mitelman will speak, followed by a question and answer period. If you have any questions, please chat them to Rebecca Levy or me. Please remember to keep your microphone muted, but feel free to share your video. We are thrilled to have you with us, Rabbi Mitelman, and now the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you. It's wonderful to be with all of you here. One of the downsides is that we can't do it in person, but one of the upsides is that it's a lot less travel for everybody here. So it's nice to be able to be with you all and think about and talk about this interplay of science and religion. And George Streisand has been a friend and colleague for quite a few years. So I'm not sure, George, if you're here, but if you are, nice to be able to see you. What I want to do is I want to share a little bit about the way that we think about and talk about the interplay between science and religion. We're calling this session, Has Science Replaced God? I'm going to tell you right now, my answer is no. Science has not and will not replace God. Hopefully you won't log off now. Hopefully we'll be able to explore these kinds of questions. But what I want to unpack for a little bit is why. Why do we think science has or will replace God? Who thinks that? How and why? And why is that not accurate in this time and place right now in 2020 America? So what I want to start with is I want to share just a little bit about my background and a little bit about the launch of Sinai and Synapses, which has been in existence since 2013. And then we're going to talk through a few different ways that we hear about the conversation about science and religion. So I grew up in a Reformed synagogue when I grew up in Westchester County, New York. When I was born, my father was the president of our synagogue, so I literally grew up walking around in the synagogue. My mother was on the board, so I would often go, she'd have all these board meetings late at night, and I'd be in the library. So I felt very, very at home in the synagogue and felt very dedicated and devoted to my Judaism. And at the same time, I also loved math and science. I would do experiments at home. I never blew off an eyebrow, but I would do different water pieces of like what actually had more volume. I would pour water from one glass to another, and is it the same? And I would explore conservation of mass and conservation of volume. And even more than science, I was very, very deep into math. I really loved the answers that math provided, that if you worked hard enough and if you thought clearly enough, you could actually walk through a proof, or if you figure this out and say, okay, if I start with these assumptions and follow these steps, then I'm going to end up with an answer. And that was incredibly satisfying. I've always loved puzzles, and so I love trying to be able to solve these kinds of questions. And so growing up, I loved both of these pieces, and they never really felt separated out. They were always part of who I was, but they never really felt in conflict until I started to grow up a little bit more and went to college. And I actually started college as a math major, and then discovered about halfway through my sophomore year of college that math was actually not quite as fulfilling as it had been, and it got really, 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 really difficult. And I said, you know what, I think I'm going to move away from this. And one reason that I started to realize was moving away from math towards religion and Jewish studies was because math would give me these wonderful answers, because there are all these great questions that exist. And math would give me these absolutely fantastic answers that were beautiful. But life doesn't have answers in my mind. Life has responses. My mother would often say that life is not a multiple choice question, life is an essay question. And so trying to be able to solve all of these answers stopped being very fulfilling for me. I actually much more enjoyed trying to think through, what about this perspective? What about that perspective? I actually started to study a little bit more about rabbinic literature and how the rabbis would argue. And I think it's the great Fiddler on the Roof joke, where two people are arguing and one makes an argument and the rabbi says, you're right. And the other person makes the argument and the rabbi says, you're right. And the third person says, Rabbi, how can they both be right? And the rabbi says, you know what? You're right. And that's the way that a lot of life works. It's not very simple binary answers. And as I got older and older and older and started thinking more about the way that the political sphere enters into some of these questions, these binary yes, no, either or, us versus them mentality, I started to see that in more and more places. And we are now seeing in America this perception of an either or perspective here, where on one side is viewed as generally scientific and educated and liberal and usually urban, and on the other side is religious and conservative and uneducated and rural. And there's generally a belief that if you buy anything in either of those columns, you've got to buy everything in that column. And the conversation between those two poles, about maybe 40 years ago, the conversation would have been, that's interesting. Tell me about your life. Tell me about how you came to that belief system. Why do you follow this particular political philosophy? Why do you support this particular belief system? Why are you scared or excited about this kinds of issues? And it became conversations where you could really have discussions with other people. But over about the last maybe 40, 45 years, the conversation has changed from, wow, that's an interesting perspective, let me hear what you've got to say, to, no, I'm right. And then it moved to, I'm right, you're wrong. And then it became, I'm right, you're stupid. And now it's, I'm right, you're evil. And it's really become this belief where with these two poles, it is better, at least there's a perception, it is better if you demonize the other side and score points against each other rather than actually trying to grapple with the big questions that we're dealing with. And so one thing that we really think about with Sinai and Synapses is that the biggest questions that we're facing in this world are not religious questions and they're not scientific questions, they're human questions. Where do we and where can we find the wisdom from both sides? And I think an even bigger question is, how can we talk to people that we may disagree with? How can we talk with people that we may not even like? How can we have a more constructive conversation with them? We don't need to agree with them. We don't even have to necessarily like them, but we're all in this world together. What can we do that's going to be more constructive rather than destructive? So what I want to do is I want to present 4 different models of the way that the public conversation is happening using science and religion as a proxy. This is a larger discussion that's happening, you know, that involves the political elements, it involves questions of identity, but the conversations that are happening around science and religion, they're part of a larger American conversation that's happening right now, actually a larger worldwide conversation right now. And I want to show 4 models of the way this conversation is happening to understand why are we even asking the question, has science replaced God? I think it's in large part because of these different ways that we're thinking about and talking about the interplay of science and religion and how that plays itself out in American society today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I think we'll be able to share these slides later. These are not going to be tremendously exciting slides. I'm going to pull off from these in this way, but this is a presentation that's, how science replaced God, but it's really how do we talk about science and religion. And so these are the questions that we're going to be able to explore. So the 4 models that we're going to look at, and they're going to go in increasing order of sophistication. And the lowest model is what we would call the conflict model. All 4 models, by the way, are going to start with the first same 3 letters of C-O-N, so hopefully it'll be easy to remember. First model is the conflict model. The conflict model is science is on one side, religion is on the other. If you pick one, you've got to demonize the other. And that's the perception that exists in the conflict model. So what I want to do is I want to pause, and hopefully, Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong. People can type in the chat to everybody. I don't know if people can do this or not. Hopefully people can write in the chat, or they can write to us as the hosts here. What I want to do is I want to ask one question, or I'm going to ask one question to start. We're going to do a couple more questions. But the first question on this is, when you think of this model, this science versus religion, pick one and reject the other, who comes to mind? When you think of this model, and it might be somebody that you know, it might be somebody that exists in the public sphere. When you think of this model, who comes to mind? And you can just type that in the chat, and either, I don't know if everyone will be able to see, or at least Matt and I can be able to read it here, and we can see some of the answers here. And I'm going to just stop sharing my screen. So Richard, whoever said Richard, so someone said Richard Dawkins. We're going to come back to Richard Dawkins in a few minutes. Anti-abortionists, that's one that somebody has said. Ultra-Orthodox Jews, that's one that comes up as well. Trump. So when I present, sometimes people will say Republicans, and I'm going to have to correct you on that because it's not exactly true. Spinoza, that's an interesting idea that somebody brought up. William Jennings Bryan, Christopher Hitchens. You're all thinking about really excellent evangelicals. So the person who said evangelicals, and it links sometimes with Republicans, I want to start, and I want to tease that out a little bit because it's something that I wasn't aware of for me as a liberal Jew living in suburban New York, that may also be an issue for all of you living in suburban DC, that there is a distinction between evangelical Christianity and fundamentalist Christianity. And this was a distinction that I didn't totally understand. So an evangelical Christian is somebody who wants to be able to say, I want to have people accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. They're trying to spread the good news there. Now, there are, by the way, quite a few liberal evangelicals. There are a large number of liberal evangelicals. There is actually a whole group of evangelical Christians who are advocating for climate change. The difference between an evangelical and a fundamentalist is someone who takes the Bible literally. They are people who would have a bumper sticker that says, God says it, I believe it, that settles it. Right? They're the ones who would say, the Bible is very clear on X or Y or Z, and that is going to guide my perspective here. So evangelicals can have a little bit more of a flexible theology. So I want to just tease out that these religion versus science people, for those who buy into it, it is going to be predominantly the fundamentalist Christians, not so much the evangelical Christians. And there's a little bit of an overlap with people who tend to be Republican, but it's not a complete overlap here. Somebody said fundamentalists, yep, and anti-vaxxers. So I want to actually spend a couple of minutes talking about why a fundamentalist Christian, we'll talk about the other side in a second, but why a fundamentalist Christian might buy into this model. Because it is probably very difficult for us to be able to get into that mentality. And what I want to do is I want to actually try, if we can, to be able to get into their shoes. Because part of the problem, I think, in our society is that we deal with caricatures and we go, oh my God, how could somebody believe in this? It drives me nuts, as opposed to saying, tell me, how did you come to believe in this? Right? It's the same question, but it's a different tenor. And at least trying to understand a couple of phrases that I love of what's your animating anxiety? In community organizing, a couple of the questions are what keeps you up at night and what gets you up in the morning? And being able to think of a fundamentalist and say, what keeps you up at night to be able to say, I am going to hold religion and reject science? And that's a really hard thing for, if you tend to be somebody who's a little bit more on the liberal side and tend to not necessarily engage with a lot of fundamentalists, it's a hard thing to do. But I want to put a couple of different arguments out here. And by the way, as I'm talking, if there are questions that come up or responses, please feel free to write in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on that and try to respond to it as we go, because there's going to be a lot, and I want to make sure that we can respond as we go along here. So, couple of things. Fundamentalist Christians are not against science. That is a misconception. Fundamentalist science are not against science. How do I know this? Couple of reasons. One, almost every fundamentalist has one of these. Almost every fundamentalist goes to a doctor in some capacity, right? Almost every fundamentalist makes sure their refrigerator is plugged in. They are not against science and technology. It's predominantly, the view is on two pieces of science, because they're not against even science. They're really against two pieces: climate change and evolution. All of the political pieces and the arguments to school boards, I would be willing to, I can't guarantee this, but I would be willing to bet a gigantic amount of money that if you were to scour all of the school boards in all of North America, there are 0 cases asking schools not to teach Newton's laws of motion. I would venture to say there are 0 school boards that are being asked, do not teach thermodynamics. They are being said, do not teach evolution, and often as they get older, it's a little bit of the climate change piece. I want to touch on the evolution. This is somebody said is what about creation? And masks is an interesting question too. Hopefully I'll come back to that. I want to focus on this question of creation and evolution. So there are a couple of different reasons as to why fundamentalists tend to be against evolution. And one is philosophical and the other is sociological. One is philosophical. Evolution, as it is taught and as it is understood in the scientific community, evolution is purposeless. It does not have a goal. We just happen to be a species that happen to survive, and our needs match with what the environment is. There is no all-knowing, all-guiding, all-loving creator. Evolution is purposeless. Religion, and I think this is true both for Judaism and Christianity, tend to say we have a personal relationship with God. God has a goal for us. That is a direct contradiction. If your belief system is God has a plan for me, God loves me, there is something that is meaningful in my life that has been ordained by God, evolution, as it is often taught, is terrifying. Because what it becomes is evolution leads to atheism, leads to nihilism. And nihilism is a scary, scary place to be. Atheism is also kind of a scary place to be. So they're not even going to touch that. They're going to try to nip it in the bud. which I think I can actually very much understand. The other reason is sociological. If you are a member of a church group, and if you're a member of a synagogue, you probably know this too, and you experience this too. The synagogue is not just where you join together to share your belief systems. It's where, when somebody dies, people show up to be able to give you food. If somebody has a baby, they're going to be able to help that family get through the next couple of weeks. This is going to be their social circle. This is where their friends are going to be. And if one person, it's 14-year-old, raises their hand and says, hey, by the way, I think evolution has a lot to commend it. And you know what? I'm not quite sure. I think maybe God doesn't necessarily have a guiding for us. What's going to happen to that family? What's going to happen to that community? They're going to be ostracized. They're going to lose their social circle. That is not something that we want to be able to lose. So that, I think, is a big reason as to why a lot of fundamentalists often reject or push against the level of teaching evolution, and I think that is a big issue here. And someone said, the Big Bang theory was also rejected because the universe was, the Big Bang can also be challenging for a lot of people because, well, does it mean that there's nothing meaningful here, right? That there's a randomness here. Anything that tends to say there is not a purpose to the universe, that is a scary, scary place to be. So I think I can understand where that perception comes from. I want to flip and talk about the other side of this conversation, which is why scientists reject religion, or the particular people who reject science, who accept science and reject religion. There are a couple of different pieces. One, again, is the sociological element. If you are working as a bench scientist or a researcher and you tend to come out as a religious person, there may be implications. There are actually quite a number of stories and some data of a lot of religious scientists do not feel comfortable talking about their religious tradition or their faith. And on some level, that's totally reasonable, because when you're working as a bench scientist, when you're working as a researcher, your faith doesn't come into it, right? Your experiment is your experiment. Whatever you believe, that doesn't enter into the scientific study there. But I think some of that is being able to say, I'm a religious person. You're saying, that's a weirdo. Why would I even want to tell anybody that I'm a religious, that I go to church each week, or that I daven at this Orthodox synagogue? So there's a sociological element, and again, there's a philosophical element, because there's in the same way that fundamentalists view evolution as a little bit of a caricature, scientists will view religion as a little bit of a caricature. They will view religion as a collection of silly, idiotic, Bronze Age myths. Why should I be following that? It's all useless. And so there's a perception that if we accept science, we need to reject religion from a philosophical perspective. So that is a large part of this here. So we can understand at least why people on both sides of this conversation would reject one side or the other. What I want to do, though, is I want to talk about why that's a problematic perspective. And there are a couple of people who are bringing up some counterexamples here as well, and we'll talk about these counterexamples in a couple of minutes. But I want to talk about why this model is problematic, and there are a couple of reasons as to why it's problematic. Number one is that when we're arguing against straw man arguments. We're actually, by the way, seeing this politically, and not knowing people's perspective here, but my guess is that you probably have friends, like in real life friends, not social media friends, but you probably have friends on the other side of the political aisle, and you don't view them as horrible, evil people. But when we see the perceptions on social media from either side, we are seeing the worst of both sides, and it becomes the caricature. And again, not talking too much. Somebody said that Donald Trump is actually not arguing against Joe Biden right now. He's arguing against what he thinks Joe Biden is like. And that's where he's arguing. And so we argue against the people that we want to be arguing against, but not actually the people who are presenting these kinds of conversations. So one of the reasons that this is problematic is that we're arguing not against the best of the best. We're taking every side's best argument and punching down of each side's worst argument. So that's one reason that's problematic. Another reason that's problematic, I think it's also destructive. If you're going to be arguing, you want to be arguing as a machloket l'shem hashamayim. You want to be arguing to be able to try to get a clearer sense of what's actually true, what's going to be the best policy, what's going to be working here, as opposed to scoring points against each side. Now, look, I'm a human being. There are moments where I want to be able to score points. But the question is, what do we want to be doing here? Where can we be trying to be effective in this kind of way? So the conflict model is great to get a lot of eyeballs. It's great to get a lot of clicks. It's great to get everybody really, really angry, because conflict gets us really excited, but it's not really helpful for actually moving the ball forward. I want to share actually a little example of this, of why this is so destructive. I think, again, not knowing where people are politically, but I think we can sort of understand where we see there's destruction on the right towards the left of combating science education. That's something that's a little bit more obvious. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that, but I do want to highlight where the destructive nature comes from the scientific side. And somebody brought up Richard Dawkins. If you don't know Richard Dawkins, Dawkins is one of the most brilliant scientists and one of the absolute worst theologians out there. Richard Dawkins was a professor, and still is. He's a professor of, I believe he's evolutionary biology at the University of, I think he's Cambridge. And he wrote a book about 15 years ago that got very, very popular called The God Delusion. He is one of what people call the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse of Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Dawkins. There are a couple of other people. Bill Maher falls into that category. There's a guy named Jerry Coyne who's at the University of Chicago who's in there. But Richard Dawkins, in 2012, Dawkins is at Oxford, thank you. In 2012, Dawkins decided that he was going to run what he called a reason rally. Now, raise your hand. This was in 2012, so this was also April of 2012, so it was an election year. Just out of curiosity, if you heard there was a reason rally that was happening about 6 months before a major political election, would you think that was a good thing? All you know is it's the reason rally. Raise your hand if you think that would be a good thing and want to go to. Yeah, most people, if you hear the reason rally, that's an important thing. I would like to have reasonable conversations. I'd like my policies to be reasonable. In the reason rally, I'm going to share a little clip from this that he himself shared. This is from his YouTube channel, talking about Catholics. And I want you to imagine that you are a mildly reasonable Catholic, somebody who has, I would say, neutral to mildly positive views on science, but you don't really think all that much about it. But you will respond to how a science educator talks about science, and how is the scientist going to engage me? How is the scientist going to be able to listen to me and my fears and what's going on here? So I want you to imagine that you are a mildly liberal Catholic who thinks science potentially is good, not totally sure, but at least willing to listen. And this is the message that you hear from Richard Dawkins, the great speaker and advocate for science education at the Reason Rally. So I'm going to bring this up here. Oh, I need to be able to get to this. All right. Are people seeing Dawkins? No. All right. Oh, sorry. I have to share this way. Okay. Okay, now hopefully you should be able to hear. This is the end of his talk.
So, when I meet somebody who claims to be religious, my first impulse is don't believe you. I don't believe you until you tell me, do you really believe, for example, if they say they're Catholic, do you really believe that when a priest blesses a wafer, it turns into the body of Christ? Are you seriously telling me you believe that? Are you seriously saying that wine turns into blood? Mock them, ridicule them. In public. Don't fall for the convention that we're all too polite to talk about religion. Religion is not off the table. Religion is not off limits. Religion makes specific claims about the universe which need to be substantiated and need to be challenged and, if necessary, need to be ridiculed with contempt.
So you can probably guess that that would not have gone over so well if you were a liberal Catholic. Being told that you are going to be mocked and ridiculed in public with contempt, that is not, as somebody said, that is a way to make friends and influence enemies. That is right. That's not a way to have a constructive conversation. That immediately shuts everything down. So that's another reason as to why this model is so destructive. I'm going to give a little bit of hope though, because the last reason that this model is so unproductive is because it's a much smaller population of the American populace than you might think. If you were to only watch the news or scroll through social media or read headlines, you would think that about 85, 90% of the American population would buy into this model because conflict sells. Conflict gets eyeballs on there. But the best study by a professor named Elaine Howard Eklund, who's at Rice University, who's done a lot of research on this, the total number of people who buy into this model, the conflict model, is actually only about 25%. 75% of Americans buy into a different model here, but only 25%, 1 in 4, buy into the conflict model. What's interesting is that the percentage of evangelicals who buy into this model is also 1 in 4. What's also really, really interesting is that the percentage of Jews who buy into this model is also 25%, 1 in 4. Now, what I think is particularly fascinating, what's really, really, really interesting to me, is that if you are a conflicted evangelical, if you're an evangelical Christian who buys into this model, the answer, the percentage is going to be, you're going to be most likely to be somebody who accepts the side of religion and rejects science. If you're a conflicted evangelical, you're likely to accept religion and reject science. The number there is about 3 out of 4. If you're a conflicted Jew, the number there, it's going to be, you're actually going to pick science over religion. And the challenge there is that you're going to be, the number there is about 15 out of 16. About 80-something% of the Jewish population, the conflicted Jews, accept science and reject religion. So one line that we often say through Sinai and Synapses is the challenge in the Jewish community is not getting Jews excited about science, it's about getting Jews excited about Judaism. So one of our big projects is, and actually we're about to open up a next round of this, I think later this week, a project called Scientists in Synagogues, of helping scientists who are members of communities be able to think about and talk about these kinds of questions in more constructive ways. And I spent a lot of time in the presentation on this piece of it because we spend a lot of time, this is where a lot of where we think the conversation is. So I want to move to the next level up from the conflict model to the next level that's a little bit more constructive, not tremendously, but a little bit more constructive. And I'm going to hopefully be able to share my screen here. And this is what we would call the concert model. The concert model is science and religion overlap. This is an idea that if you are accepting one, you can actually meld them both if you read the Bible in the right way. then actually it matches with everything scientific. So this may be something that, and this may be, by the way, a model that you buy into. Excuse me, and if this makes you uncomfortable, where I'm going to say why it's problematic, hopefully you'll leave with a more productive way to be able to think about this. But this is one way to be able to think about it as, if you read Genesis in the right way, it actually matches with the theory of evolution. Or this is a way we can actually understand how the Exodus happened or how the Red Sea happened. This is one that actually a lot of people like for a whole variety of different reasons here. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. This is one reason that a lot of people like this, is because it allows people to be able to hold both of those. They can say, I can have my science and I can have my religion, and they're not going to conflict. I can have them, and in fact, they're going to match. And we can understand why somebody would want that, because if you're living in a world where you take religion seriously, and you take religion seriously, and you take science seriously, then you want to be able to have both of these. And it's nice, it's comforting. The problem is that it doesn't really work. And I'm going to explain, I'm going to give a couple examples of this as to why. The first reason as to why it's problematic is, first of all, it means that it entails a tremendous amount of mental gymnastics. When I was growing up, when I would go to the grocery store, at the checkout counter, there was the National Enquirer and the Weekly World News. You may have seen those also. And it felt like about every 3 weeks, there was a breaking story that they discovered the Garden of Eden, or they found out where Noah's Ark was. And I'm like, you found it 3 weeks ago. It was a banner headline 3 weeks ago. He said, I found Noah's Ark. Why is this news? You found it already, right? Isn't that what you said? And so part of that is because we're trying very hard to be able to say, wait, I want to hold both of these things together. We're trying to prove science. We're trying to use science to prove religion. And the problem is that science doesn't prove. Science disproves. Science's job is not to get us truth. Science's job is to help us become progressively less wrong. Right? Newton was great. His laws of gravitation were great. They worked, but they're wrong now. Einstein is correct, right? It's not that and Einstein is not going to be totally the proof is going to be, there are refinements that are going to happen there in this kind of way. But science doesn't say, here is the truth that comes from up on high, and we know what this is. We're imperfect human beings. Science is a process. And so what science, and if there are scientists here, hopefully you can correct me if I'm wrong, but ideally, in the ideal process, science starts with what's called the null hypothesis, of being able to say, here is my assumption, please show me all the ways I've made a mistake or might have missed this. That's what science is supposed to be. Religion is a very different perspective here. What tends to happen is that if you're using science to be able to prove religion, that's not going to happen. But what might happen is science might disprove religion. And I'll give my favorite example of this, and hopefully this will not destroy your faith. But this is a very powerful example in my mind. So if you were to accept that the Torah was actually literally true, the way it was written, a historical document exactly as written, then that would have implied that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah, they all were real people too. If that was true, as far as we can tell, they would have lived around the year 2000 BCE, 1800 BCE, about 3,000 years ago or so. There's a really important animal that comes up in the story of Isaac and Rebecca, about Abraham's servant going to Rebecca, and the servant says, please God, let me find a woman who will say, when I say, please give me water, that she will also say, please let me have and somebody said this, my camel, right? The camels are a key element of that story. The camel did not enter into that part of the world until about the year 900 BCE, about 1,000 years too late, which is fine for when the Torah was written. The Torah knew by the time it was written, the camels existed, but it wasn't there from when Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah were there. And so all of a sudden, you pull on this little thread and the whole tapestry unravels. Right? What if you've ever met any seventh graders will say, yeah, how can you prove to me that the Big Bang, how can I read the Genesis and knowing what the Big Bang says? Big Bang is accurate, evolution is accurate. Why are you telling me that Noah's Ark is a real thing? And if you're teaching your kids that all of these things are literal, actual, true things, the kids are going to say, wait a second, I've been lied to my whole life. And so what tends to happen is that if you're buying into this idea of science trying to prove your religion, what's going to happen is that it's going to collapse into the conflict model. This is a large part of what happens to both fundamentalists and in the Jewish community, because fundamentalists will say, this is my community, this is my source of truth, I am going to have this here, I am going to create a wall and not even engage in these questions of science. And what happens in the Jewish community, particularly for younger students, they will accept the science and reject religion and not be able to explore a more nuanced view on religion and God. So with this question of has science replaced God, why this question exists, partially it's because we're too often taught at this concert model and we don't stop at a more sophisticated way of thinking about these questions. We tend to accept that science and religion are talking about the same kinds of things in the same kinds of processes, and we're using the same methodologies. And if we use the same methodologies, we're going to be deeply, deeply disappointed. As somebody said here, religion is not about proof. It's about belief. I think it's actually even a little more than about belief. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you are saying that religion is about proof, and if you're saying that science is about proof, it's going to be a big, big problem about your belief system here. So what I want to do, we've got a few minutes, and I want to do the next two models and open this up for some Q&A. And I've seen a couple of good questions that I've had to sort of ignore to make sure that we can get through all of this here. So I want to move to the third model here. So that we've got the conflict model, which is, in my mind, kind of useless. It's fine. It works for what it's going to work, but I kind of view it as a pile of rubble. Next model up is the concert model. That works. I usually say it can survive a heavy rainstorm, but a heavy rainstorm will still knock it down. The next model up is one that generally can survive up to a hurricane, right? It can survive for a long, long time. This is what we would call, is the contrast model. Contrast model is science is over there, religion is over there. They can happily live in their separate spheres. This is a simpler version of what some people call from Stephen Jay Gould of non-overlapping magisteria. You may have heard this as science deals with how, religion deals with why. They can very happily have in their separate spaces. This is, by the way, the most common view that Jews buy into. This is one where a lot of traditional Jews can say, 6 days a week, I work as a doctor, I work as a bench scientist, I work in accounting, I work in politics, I do my work 6 days a week, and on Shabbat and on Chag, I daven and I'm with my community, but they don't have anything to do with each other. And that's how most Jews tend to think about this. And again, it usually works pretty well because probably for most of you, the question of science and religion is not a live issue day to day. It's a live issue for me because this is my full-time job. It's something I've got to think about all the time, but you are thinking about, am I going to be able to pay the bills? Am I going to be able to hug my children or my grandchildren? That's a question that you're grappling with right now. Do I need to put on a mask to go to the grocery store? When are things going to open back up? What's happening in the political sphere, right? You've got other things on your mind. You are not thinking about, well, let me think about the philosophical implications of are we alone in the universe? That may be something that you think about at times, but not necessarily on a day-to-day level. And that's because our day-to-day level, our day-to-day lives are surrounded by an intellectual and cultural milieu that we're not even aware of. Coming back from also a rabbinic text of and I think there's the joke too of the fish who doesn't even know that they're swimming in water, right? We're not even aware of all of the thoughts and ideas that are influenced us from media, from our relationships, from our community, from our teachers, from our parents, from our children. We are so immersed, and the trajectory changes slowly. It's very, 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 very rare that like there's a boom, there's a paradigm shift. The paradigm shift happens slowly, 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 and it's not until looking back in retrospect that you can understand that, wow, the world is totally different now. Because what's happened is that the questions that had been the realm of religion, science has entered into. And science has actually encroached on what had been religion's world and religion's domination there. So, because if we were to get on a time machine and go back to the 13th century, and if I were to ask you, what is the center of the universe? What is the center of the universe? Your answer would be the Earth, and maybe me. I'm the center of the universe, or at the very least, the Earth is the center of the universe. And how would you believe that? Well, you believe that. Maybe it's because your religious teachers taught that, but really the reason that you would think that is that that's what your eyes said. You looked up and everything's going around you. You feel like you're stationary. You had no reason to doubt anything. That's what you did on a day-to-day basis. And you were probably worried about, am I going to have enough food to get through the winter? That's, you're not thinking about, am I the center of the universe? But then Copernicus and Galileo changed that, and that changed a lot of the philosophical questions, and it created a real crisis in the church, and it created a little bit of some questions in the Jewish community as well, and said, okay, all right, so maybe the Earth is not the center of the universe, and that changed the way that we viewed our relationship to the stars and the cosmos. And then if I were to ask you in 1840, how did human beings come to be? And your answer would be probably God created us this way. Why? Because you didn't know anything different, and your rabbi or your priest or your, I wouldn't be a pastor yet, or maybe your pastor, they would be saying, no, this is, you're created in the image of God, and didn't know how evolution by natural selection happened. But then 1859, Darwin comes into an existence, and then it creates a big philosophical question of how linked are we to other animals? Are we part of nature, or are we a part of or apart from the rest of nature? These are questions that people started to really think about. And so what ended up happening, particularly in the 16th and 17th century, is that science took the mantle of truth from religion. Religion was the source of truth. That was your authority. Science said, you know what, we're going to help you become a little bit more accurate about this world. We're not going to look towards where did we come from. That's not going to be religion anymore. That's going to be science's job. And that took some time, but religion as a whole then started to say, okay, if we're not going to be about truth, we're going to be about ethics. We're going to be about good people. So if you are anything like me, I was definitely raised this way, that Judaism is about being a good person. And this is something that we're taught in a lot of ways still, right? Being Jewish is about being a good person. Being religion is about being a good person. Let me ask you a question. Do you know somebody who is religious and is not a particularly good person? Do you know somebody who is a good person who is also not religious? Right? QED. Religion does not equal ethics. Right? You can be a good person without being religious, and you can be religious without being a good person. There is a little bit of it. There's definitely a link there, but religion no longer has the mantle of being able to say, this is what truth is going to be. Religion has had to actually talk a little bit now much more about meaning. How can I find a sense of who I am in this world and a connection with the larger world? And so the contrast model, that works until a paradigm shift happens. And I would venture to guess that in 2200, 2300, 2400, if we're still in existence here, if there's still a world and there's still a country, that religion is going to have a different job. It's going to have a different role. There are going to be pieces where we can see a through line in retrospect, but what religious people in 2400 are going to look like, it's going to be very different than what religion looks like now, just as Judaism now in 2020 is very different than what Judaism was in 1600, which was very different than what Judaism was in 1000, which was very different than what Judaism was in the year zero. So the contrast model works again until it doesn't. And so what I want to do is I want to show this last model here that we tend to talk about through Sinai and synapses, and it's the method that I find to be the most constructive here, which is the contrast model, which is what we would call the contact model, conversation model, because the questions that we're grappling with, they're not scientific and they're not religious, they're human questions, because science advances because of scientists, and scientists are human beings. Scientists figure out, what are we looking at? Right? You ask the people who won the Nobel Prize, who were given the Nobel Prize today, about being able to find black holes. I would be shocked if if this wasn't the case, that when they were like 6 or 7, they were given a telescope and went, whoa, right? Like that's it. And I would be shocked if they were not so passionate and excited about trying to be able to find out information about black holes and the understanding of this, right? If you were to go to a cocktail party with Nobel Prize winners, they're going to be really jazzed up about their work. And so that's something that's really important. We can't lose sight of the human elements. And by the way, scientists make mistakes. Scientists have agendas. Scientists have political persuasions. Some scientists have religious identities. And I think there's something really powerful of being able to say, and a couple of people have brought this up, that Francis Collins, who is the head of the NIH, some of you may actually even know him or work with him or connect with him, one of the great communicators about science and religion. He is a phenomenal scientist, and he is not shy about talking about his faith, and is able to say this has inspired him. It's helped him do this incredible work from the Human Genome Project to running the NIH, and it's not, his religion isn't impacting his science, but it's able to say that the human element of who Francis Collins is as a human being, he is both a scientist and a person of faith, and it's not a contradiction because he's Francis. He's also a singer, right? Like that's part, like why there's no conflict between his love of playing guitar and his science here. And I think being able to say this is our full element of the humanity, that's who we are. In the same way that religion are elements of being able to help us understand what does it mean to be human. And when I present on this, people will sometimes say, why do you use the word religion and not God or faith or belief? And a couple of people in the chat brought up the question about belief, because religion is not about belief. They're different words. Religion from the Latin is religio, which means to bind people together. Religion is a communal structure. Religion is a set of rituals. Religion is a set of norms. Religion is a sense of community. It's the great Jewish joke of somebody saying, "Why do you go to synagogue? You don't believe in God. Why are you at Shabbat services every Shabbat?" And it says, "Well, Schwartz believes in God, and I come to synagogue to come talk to Schwartz." That's kind of what religion is about. It's how do we create a connection here? There was an article in the Huffington Post a while ago, which is, it's not as interesting to be able to talk to someone about how they're spiritual but not religious. In many ways, what's more important is, are you religious but not spiritual? because it's how do we create a sense of community here? How do we create a sense of creating a better sense of humanity? And my absolute favorite example of how religion and science, by the way, can come together in this way, this contact model, is from one of my favorite teachers. He's a good friend of mine, a professor named David DeSteno at Northeastern University, who directs the Social Emotional Lab at Northeastern University. He has a new book coming out called How God Works. He is an atheist scientist who loves religion, because one thing that he has said is religion has had thousands and thousands of years of trying to be able to figure out, how do I act in this world? It's got a lot of good tools. And so how does it work? Not the belief system. Let's talk about this. And so one of the things that he has studied is compassion. We know this from our text. The world stands on three things: al shosha devarim, on Torah, on prayer, and on acts of loving kindness, and on gimilut chasadim. That compassion and loving kindness is one of the most important elements of these interpersonal kinds of relationships here. And DeSteno has done work on how do we engender a level of compassion. And you can spend weeks talking about texts on compassion, and it's really important and it's really valuable, and we can understand how that can help us have language about this. But what he has discovered is that there's a really, really, really easy way to engender compassion in other people. And it's to be able to create a sense of similarity. If you can find a point of connection or similarity, you are going to be more compassionate to them. They're going to be more compassionate to you. And he's given a couple of examples, and they're different. They measure it, which are different things from, they'll have a Confederate who's carrying pens and they'll knock the pens over, and how many pens do they pick up? Or how many minutes do they helping somebody with a really difficult math problem? So they've got metrics to be able to look at this. And one example that they do is they create these totally artificial elements about compassion, where they'll have a facade, and they'll be able to say, "Hi, I'm so glad you're here to come to the lab, to be able to talk about the lab. What we want to be able to do is we want you to be able to look at how long some lines are. How good are you at being able to say the line? How do you recognize how long certain lines are?" And they would do that, and they would say, "Interesting, you actually thought the line was a little bit longer than it actually is. You're an overestimator." And they would say to other people, "Oh, interesting, you thought it was a little shorter. You're an underestimator." And then they would have this Confederate of knocking over the pens, and what they discovered is that overestimators were more compassionate to fellow overestimators, and underestimators were more compassionate to fellow underestimators. And that was something that they had zero baggage, zero history, right? There are not people arguing, holding up signs saying, "I am an overestimator, my father was an overestimator, we need to make sure we teach only overestimation in schools," right? Nobody's teaching that in this kind of way. It was a totally manufactured level of similarity, and it connected people together and it engendered a level of compassion. So when we're saying scientific versus religious, or Democrat versus Republican, liberal versus conservative, that's going to lower our ability to be compassionate towards other people. But if we say, "Oh, this is somebody who likes the same diner that I do," that's a way where you can be able to have an extra level of compassion. And to me, that's where God lives. That's at least a little bit of my theology, that God exists from the interplay, from the conversations, from the growth, that God is and there's a wonderful book by Nancy Ellen Abrams about God as an increasing level of diversity and connection and dynamism, that God exists in this space that exists. And so science can actually, not only is science not going to replace God, science can help us actually become closer to God in a lot of ways. And so when we think about the conversations that we're having about science and religion, we need to realize that the conflict model is going to ultimately be destructive. The concert model will work until it collapses. The contrast model is great, but we need to recognize the intellectual and cultural and political milieu that we're living in. But if we're able to say we are all human beings grappling with how can I live in this world, then we can have more conversations. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Matt for about, I guess we have about 30 minutes so for some Q&A.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to continue to add them to the chat box now. There's been a lot of comments, and so I just want to make sure that it doesn't, your question doesn't get lost in the mix. Very early on, there was, you referenced masks, and somebody had asked about masks. So I wasn't sure if you wanted to start by jumping back to that.
Yeah, I can do that. And actually, we did a seminar with a woman named Professor Kaylin O'Connor, who's done some excellent work on misinformation, and she actually talked about this as hydroxychloroquine, which, if you were to ask me in October of 2019, what is hydroxychloroquine, I would have gone, what? And I think many of us would have done that. In February, it may have raised your eyebrows, but it was in basically March and April that it became a partisan issue. It became a political issue. Masks too have become a political partisan issue. And somebody was mentioning this there in this way, and it's in a lot of ways, it's because ideology has become identity. It has become a marker on both sides. I think on some example that it's become on the right. It's become an element of I have my freedom, and you shall not violate my freedom. That's where that comes from. And on the left there's a lot of shaming that happens, which by the way I think is not totally, but extremely counterproductive. Because again, in the same way as Richard Dawkins saying, mock them in public with contempt, that's not going to get somebody to put a mask on, right? Saying, how dare you do this? So the masks have become, because and this is something that Professor O'Connor has talked about, that we naturally tribalize, and we actually become. We listen to the people that we listen to, and we either ignore or demonize the people on the other side. And as it becomes a little bit clearer, it becomes much more black and white. So masks actually were not that partisan a while ago. Look, in March or April, Anthony Fauci had said he was actually against masks. There was an article, there was an interview in 60 Minutes. And I think one thing that's important to also understand scientifically is to draw a distinction between information that we thought was accurate then, but now we need to correct, to well-meaning but false information from willful lying. Right? They're different pieces here. So masks were, the shift happened from information that we didn't quite know about to now has become a willful element of that. And so as we're thinking about masks and how do we encourage people to be asking people about masks, I think the more that we can do it frame it as not a partisan issue and not I am a better person because I am wearing a mask and you are a worse person for not wearing a mask. But rather to engage in that conversation. Now, that may not be something that you want to do at a Starbucks. Right? You probably don't want to be talking to people and hear their life story, or on some level, you just got to say, all right, I'm going to stay 12 feet away from them. But there's been a lot of research that suggests that if you're actually able to, a great line of be curious and not furious, you're actually going to be much more effective. It sometimes feels good to be able to say, how could you not be wearing a mask? I can't believe those people are not wearing masks. But if you actually want them to wear the mask, a slightly different tack needs to be taken.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions going back to your theology at the end about God's sentience and why worship God or even call God. And
Yeah. One of my favorite lines is, all theology is really autobiography. What we say about God has much more to say about ourselves than it says about God, because this is an example that I like, and particularly if you're a scientific person, this may resonate. I'm not sure, but this has worked for me in a lot of ways. There is an idea of what's called a scientific object. So a scientific object, which is what something is as we understand it right now. And I'll give the example of the Earth. The Earth has been whatever the Earth has been. I have zero control over whatever the Earth has been over its 4.6 billion years. The Earth has been its history. But what we understand about the Earth has changed a lot over the last 200 years. Lord Kelvin thought that the Earth was much earlier than much younger than it actually is. We didn't know about plate tectonics. We didn't know how the interplay of ecosystems were working. So we have grown in our understanding of what the Earth is. The atoms that make up all of our bodies and all of the universe, they are whatever they are, but we have no control over that. But our understanding of atoms has changed and grown and developed and shifted. And so I sometimes like to think of God in that way, that God is whatever God is. I have zero control over what God is. I am a very fallible, very limited human being. And so I have no conception of what God is, but I can say, this is how I interact with God. This is how I experience God. And I may need to change that as new experiences, new ideas, new information, that may allow me to shift what my view is on God. So I have buy into what would be called the process theology. And if you're interested in this work, Rabbi Brad Artson has written some wonderful work on process theology. And also the book by Nancy Allen Abrams called The God That Could Be Real. That I experience God in the process. Just as science is not a collection of facts. Science is a process that helps us get a little bit closer to what actual reality is. And we're going to mess up, and we're going to be wrong. The one thing I can guarantee about science right now is that it is wrong, right? That it is incorrect right now. That doesn't mean that it's bad, and it doesn't mean that it's useless. It means that we have imperfect information, and there's going to be, God, please let us be wrong right now, so that we can get a little bit more accurate right now.
Thank you. Yeah, and sort of, there's a lot of comments here, so I'm trying to go back to where I was a second ago, but one of the comments was about how scientists look toward how maybe religion needs to literally be true, and sort of scientists hold to the, sorry, I lost it here. Just hold to that belief, and then, sorry, let me see if I can find the exact wording.
As you're doing that, there was one question. I want to respond to one question of, did man invent God? I don't know if humans invented God. I do know that humans invented religion. I view as religion as our human attempts to be able to understand and have a relationship with God. Religion, without a doubt, is a human creation. So I do not know if we invented God, or did God invent, I don't know, but I know with 100% certainty that humans invented religion, because it's a human creation. It's how do we make sense of this world?
So I found the exact wording. You can address it if it feels relevant still, but it says, don't some scientists seem to be demanding religions be literally true and not just emotionally insightful stories?
I think they are arguing against the straw man of religion. Because that's how it's often presented, and that's, by the way, how it's often presented in a Western Protestant view, that religion is about faith, religion is about belief, and that's not what religion is. that is an element of religion. There is without a doubt there is a belief system here, but religion is and I can even see if I can pull up, but what somebody described as a as a whole piece on elements of what religion actually is about. I'm just pulling up that there's a I can send this link from a friend of mine called Religion as an Adaptive System. That it's not just an element of what we call, he says that religion, which we call colloquially religions, include ritual, authority structures, obligations, norms, and norms, myths, and taboos. Those are all elements that religions have, and they're not simply belief systems.
So here's another question. Thank you. Should a goal be to reconcile God with science, or is this a question that is not really very important? Either thinking of this for oneself or as a message to the larger world.
Yeah, no, I think that the question of reconciling God and science is ultimately a fool's errand, in large part because they're dealing with different questions and different processes and trying to say, can religion prove God? Can religion prove science? Can science disprove God or disprove religion? Because religion it can be so amorphous and has so many different elements that's kind of useless. Where I think it is important is to be able to say, where are these questions where the rubber meets the road? So these can be questions of either from an element where there's a hot button and there's some conflict. So that might be evolution and creation, that might be climate change, that might be pieces about what's happening with COVID-19, right, where there might be some rubbing up, or are they questions where we can be asking that question from multiple different perspectives? So one question that I think is actually a much more generative question that I'd love to ask both scientists and religious people, which is, tell me about a moment when you felt awe and wonder and majesty. Anyone can answer that question. Scientists can talk about that question. They can talk about it however they want to talk about it, as religious people can. And yet that feeling of awe and majesty, that actually then creates a level of connection and humanity. In the same way that if you were to come in and talk about a really hot button issue in the political sphere, you don't want to start talking about, tell me about your views on abortion. Right? That's not gonna end up being a constructive conversation if you're having people from different sides of the aisle. But if you are able to start with a question along the lines of, this is a question that I loved of being able to ask somebody of, what keeps you up at night and what gets you up in the morning, and have somebody who can really facilitate that and drill down, you can actually find some places where some potential solutions can happen. Rather than trying to scream into the void of, why is the world going to hell in a handbasket? Okay, what's something that's actually a solvable issue that we can talk about?
Great, thank you. There's a couple more questions that people had on concepts of God. One question about Mordecai Kaplan's concept of God, and another one about, the question is, what makes the Jewish / Hebrew God more godly, quote, godly than other gods?
Those are interesting questions. What makes the Hebrew God more godly than other religions? That's a question that I kind of want to avoid a little bit, because the language that we talk about God, again, that's our personal descriptions of God. So the way that you might talk about God is different than the way that I would talk about God, and is different than the way, for example, a Hindu or a Buddhist or an atheist would talk about God. So there are elements that play into it, but again, when we think about this question of has science replaced God, the reason that's a question is that we tend to talk about God as an omniscient and omnipotent being. And science has given us much more knowledge and much more power. And so that's why that's become a question for us. So what's that view on God? That's going to change science has changed what our view on God is, because we have gained more and more power and more knowledge. In terms of the questions of Mordecai Kaplan, I'm not quite well versed enough in Reconstructionist theology, although I'm definitely a believer of naturalistic theology, and that God is part of this universe rather than apart from the universe. But as I would not want to necessarily, I'm ordained as a Reform rabbi, and so I don't want to necessarily overstep my bounds and speak about Reconstructionist theology, because there are others who are much more knowledgeable about that than I.
Thank you. I was wondering, we've talked a lot about God, and I was wondering just more broadly about religious experience. I read a book recently called The Flip by Geoffrey. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's about it's about scientists who have, he calls it the flip, who have had some sort of religious experience or paranormal sort of experience. He uses that word. And then sort of flip how, like some of the most very esteemed scientists, not fluent in which ones at the moment, but I wasn't sure if you had any thought. I mean, you haven't read the book, but I wasn't sure if you have any thoughts about experiences of where scientists have come to, not say about God, but different religious experiences and how that affects the conversation.
Yeah, I think it's important to be able to know what science can say and also know what science can't say. And this is a reason that I think there are a lot of religious scientists who push back against what they call scientism, which is a belief that science can answer everything. And I tend to agree that science is not going to be able to answer everything in this world. And yet, I think it's important to be able to know what science cannot talk about, what is outside of its purview, what is outside of its limitations. So if there are scientists who tend to talk about paranormal activity or ESP or things like that, then they are making scientific claims and they need to be tested. If they are saying, this is my personal experience and how it's impacted who I am, that is a completely reasonable thing, but that then doesn't impact, and it shouldn't impact their science. In the same way that when we think about questions of religion and politics, we can't separate out our religious identity and our political identity. Right? However you're voting, if you're a religious person, I am almost willing to guarantee that your religious values are impacting your political decisions. And it may depend on what your religious and political perspectives are going to be. But there is an institutional wall of church and state. And so similarly, people's religious and scientific elements, they may influence each other. If you're a religious scientist, they probably do influence each other, but there does need to be a wall between what happens in the research lab and what happens in people's personal lives.
Thank you. Yeah. You can decide whether or not you want to address this one, but there's a question. Is there a common thread that binds together what Jews, Christians, Buddhists, Muslims mean when they or we use the term God?
I would say probably the answer is no, and yet one of the things I'm a big fan. Sounds pretty big fan of the Dalai Lama. Not that I know him personally, but I really like the work of the Dalai Lama, and he's actually done tremendous work about Buddhism and science. And if you've read any of his work, he often encourages Buddhist monks to go through fMRIs and study compassion. And he's even said, if there are pieces in science that contradict Buddhism, Buddhism needs to change. I think that's true for Jewish and Christian and Muslim belief systems as well. But one thing that he has said is that that ethics and compassion is like water, and religion is the tea. And so what he means by that is that needs to be the common thread of compassion, that we're all human beings trying to balance our selfish impulses from our communal impulses. This is also something that I often teach about as well, of how do we act in an ethical way when there are complicated questions. How do we act righteously and compassionately? And that cuts across all religions there. And there's a reason that every religion has as its basis, love your neighbor as yourself, because we're social creatures, and religion is designed to be able to help us be connected here. But the different tea that the Dalai Lama talks about, some people like it spicy, and some people like 2 tea bags, and some people want sugar, and others have milk, and so there are different ways to be able to add to that water, so that the ethics undergird all of religion. There's compassion that undergirds, and language of compassion that undergirds all religion, but the way that the religion manifests itself is different. And I highly recommend the book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind, of why good people are divided by politics and religion. And he talks a lot about these kinds of questions.
There's another question here. What have U.S. religious leaders said about the dominant role of ideology in our civil discourse, which has rendered our society even more divisive?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that we're not even aware of. It's that idea of like being a fish that's in water, that we are not even aware of our contribution in the divisive conversation that's happened. And the other piece too is that ideology and identity have become linked. It used to be, this is my belief system, and these are the whether that's I'm Jewish or Christian or atheist, or these are the policies that I tend to support, to I am a Democrat, or I am a Republican, or I am a Jew, period, end of story. And there's no then opening for that, of being able to say, well, tell me about more of the ways that you're thinking about these kinds of questions. It tends to be a very superficial conversation. And so I think religious leaders, I don't know if civil discourse is necessarily needed, but we need to be more engaged in conversation with others. And I think and sometimes that is taking to task, but again, it's a question of why are you saying what you're saying? I was asked by an atheist professor of philosophy to sign a letter to evangelical Christians, and I said, I agree with what you've read, but why do you want me to write this? Why do you want me to sign this? And they said, well, I think you'd be an important voice. And I said, okay, but why would they be listening to me? And what are you trying to do? He said, well, we want to be able to show that this and that and the other. I said, okay, but that's not this is not the audience. What you're doing is counterproductive for what you're actually trying to do. So I think that's a key question for science and religion and for politics, of what are we trying to do and for whom?
So on that note, there's a question about compassion and religion, and so the question is, like, what other systems do this, and can science also might lead to compassion in the same way?
Yeah. again, I think that's one of the things that's really powerful of being able to know scientifically how we engender compassion in others, and that's again simply finding a point of connection and a point of similarity. That's an incredible piece to be able to have that. And then some of that is to be able to say, this is my language that I have to be able to talk about this. These are the texts that I use to be able to share, and to be able to say, this is my Jewish language, and Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus, they have their own separate language, in the same way that language exists not to be able to have language, but to be able to communicate. But again, nobody speaks language. People speak English or French or Swahili, and that language, they may not translate exactly, but they're all trying to be able to communicate. They're all trying to do something here. So compassion is the language, and then the specific language, which is Jewish or Christian or whatever the language is, that can manifest itself in those kinds of conversations.
Thank you. I think this is a good stopping point for questions. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, but I think one of the things is just to be able to recognize that the people that we talk to are they need to be real people and not the caricature of the other side. And it's really hard, because we can get very enmeshed in our view on conflict, because it energizes us, it excites us, and it feels good. But the question is, what are we trying to be able to do? And so if we're thinking about this question of, has science replaced God, thinking about it as a conflict, it's not so helpful. But rather thinking about, how can we use the best knowledge of science that we can to be able to connect better to ourselves, better to our community, better to others, and if we so experience it, our own view with God. Science can help us in all of those different ways, through our curiosity, through our sense of awe, and through a level of intellectual humility. And so that's where I want to leave us here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for this insightful and fascinating lecture. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it. I greatly enjoyed it myself. And, I saw there's some questions here also about receiving additional information. So we'll send out any sort of notes and slides and books that have been mentioned. We'll send those to you along with the survey in the coming days. So thank you again, Rabbi Mitelman, and thank you all for joining us tonight. And so,
thank you. Have a good night.